they meet their match in each other, and it changes both of them. They both become different people because of the struggle they go through with each other. And I really loved writing that relationship.
Welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview, where our guest today is Alice Elliott Dark, and we're going to be talking about Fellowship Point, which I received pre-publication last year. Listened to her do a fabulous chat about, read all the pre-publication interviews where it got, or reviews where it got starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, Booklist, Bookpage, as well as accolades from the New York Times and all these major publications. And okay, folks, it was also a Book Reporter Bets on selection because I loved it so much. I'd hoped to talk to Alice last summer, but our schedules never jived. But I'm happy to be connecting with her now as the paperback was released last week. And all the people I told to read it last summer, if you didn't get to it, it's your turn now. So welcome, Alice. So great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm really happy to be here too.
So let's begin by you giving us an overview of Fellowship Point and what inspired you to write it.
Okay. Well, the book opens on a snowy day in March 2000, and we see Agnes Lee, who's pretty much the main character of the book, although there are two other characters very, very close in importance. She's in her apartment in Philadelphia, and has writer's block. So she's doing her normal writing routine. She has two different writing practices. She writes anonymously, and then she has a big children's book series that has done very well for her. And then in comes her best lifelong friend. They've known each other since they were babies, and her name is Polly. And Polly and Agnes talk in Agnes's living room, and Agnes says, "Look at this article in the paper I just got." And it says that these developers near their place in Fellowship Point in Maine want to develop the point. So Agnes says, "We've always talked about making a land trust. Now is the time to do it." Polly says, 100%, except I have to talk to my husband and sons first. Right. So that sort of sets up the basic plot of the book, which is a land plot, and the basic source of conflict that comes between them in the book, which is that Polly and Agnes are as close as any people could be, but Polly also has other allegiances, and Agnes doesn't.
Yeah. And that's basically what it comes down to. It's family. Who am I going to be listening to? The arc of what I think should be happening, my best friend, and Polly gets to be all over the place as a result. Where am I going to be? Who am I going to be? This book was under contract for 20 years, which was so interesting. And was this the book you started 2 decades ago and kept writing, or evolved? No. Okay.
No, I tried to write 2 other books, and they were more autobiographical. This is completely made up. And I just couldn't figure those out. So they're sitting in big tubs in my basement. Lots of notes, attempts. But then I started this in 2011, and I really had gotten to a point where I hit rock bottom with those other 2 books. And I thought, okay, I give up. I just completely give up. And I was at a writer's residency, which I am now as well. I was at a writer's residency, and I just sat in a chair literally for 5 straight hours, looking out the window, just thinking, okay, forget it. I mean, I can't figure this out. I'll just go back to writing short stories or poems, or I'll switch completely. And all of a sudden, the character of Virgil Reed came into my mind. He was the first character that came in for the book. And for those who've read it, he doesn't turn out to have a major role in the book, but he's the first one who came, and I started writing about him. And in the course of his story, he ended up on this little island in Maine, way out in the ocean, with a tiny child. And then I had to take them off the island because it was winter. So then they went to a relative's house on Fellowship Point, and that's when Fellowship Point started to develop. And then Polly arrived in my imagination, and then Agnes arrived in my imagination, And Robert came between Polly and Agnes. So those were, when I had those major characters, the book started to build.
Yeah, it started to jive from there. I'm normally a very quick reader. I'm noted for being a book a day, mostly because of what I do. I need to read this quickly.
Yeah,
And
that's
I found
amazing.
myself really slowing down to read this book. And I remember where I was sitting outside. I was under what I call the Cleopatra tent outside by our pool.
Oh, nice. That sounds good.
Sit under together, but my husband and boys have named it that. And I sat over there and I actually read for 2 weeks and weekends, because not only was I savoring the story, I was savoring your writing and the use of language in the book. And there were so many, like, I feel like I'm so, precious saying this, beautiful sentences, but that's what it was. And I was going back and I was reading and I was folding down, so many pages, as you can see in this galley, of like things I wanted to talk about or things I wanted to think about in the book. Were you honing what you were reading in these early stages, or did that come later in the editing? Were you just getting the story down?
It's interesting. I think when I write well, I get to a very deep place and I don't really have to revise it. But I was working on all of it. When I write about nature, or there are a lot of descriptions of Maine and the natural life. And when I write that kind of writing, it just seems to come, it seems to come out almost as I want it to be. Of course, I go back and make certain, but it's just something that wells up in me. And I have to write it. I'm a 2-finger typist. So I guess I slow down just because of that. And maybe that helps. But I was doing, to answer your question, in the big picture, I was doing both at the same time. It took me a while to figure out this story because it's got a lot of moving parts and plots, subplots. There's another main character aside from Agnes and Polly named Maude, and her whole storyline I had to figure out. So I was working on the writing and the story, but actually, I've been writing for a long time and I kind of have a style. Like, a friend of mine sent me a piece of writing I had done in the 7th grade, and it was about Maine.
Wow.
Which, where I had started going, and I read it and I was like, okay, there it is. Nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. So that was really funny to me.
Did you pull any lines from the 7th grade paper for the book? Were there any
I
great
thought
lines
about
there?
it. I thought about it. There was a description of a little seal in the harbor, and I didn't do it, but I was tempted.
It's like, wow, this really does go back when. Wait, we're not 20 years, it's much further. We also go back in time with Agnes and Polly, and we see them and their friendship evolve. And it's an epic story of these friendships over these decades, and many women have friendships through the decades. And they're so different in so many ways that in some ways you can't see them being friends. And then in other ways, they're completely the same. What did you love about writing them and what goes on between them?
Well, that's such a great observation. That you have trouble seeing them as friends, because I have friends from my early childhood. And I think if I met them now, we wouldn't even meet each other now.
Right.
We're like, our lives have gone in such different directions. Than would I find them, politically compatible to me, or, lots of things have changed. Right. But I still love them the same because we've known each other for so long. And that's true of Agnes and Polly. They do go in different directions. I loved writing them because to be honest, I really didn't think it was a book about friendship. I've had that reflected to me that it is, but I think I've always had very close women friends my whole life. So to me, it's just like, of course, that's like the center of a book. Right. Of course, what else? But I loved having them withhold their opinions of each other to each other, and to be very disciplined about maintaining their friendship up until something happens in the book. But to be very disciplined all these years about not expressing any kind of negative feelings they have towards each other. Agnes is aware that Polly Polly's husband, sorry, I said that wrong. Polly's aware that Agnes does not love her husband
Right, right.
and doesn't think that he's up to her level. But she also thinks Polly has not developed her intellectual ability to the standard of where her intelligence actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And Polly thinks that Agnes went through a very rough period before she was 40, where she had to take care of her family members. But then starting at 40, she's really been living a life where she can decide what her day is going to be like every day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Polly looks at that and sort of says, "What's your problem? I mean, you have a lot of freedom." So, you know, they have their opinions about each other.
Right.
I really liked having, you know, being able to look at both of those, looking at them look askance at each other, but keep it to themselves until they couldn't.
Right. And I think they're so different people. You can see the tension between them, but you also see them tamp down the tension. You can almost feel them saying, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to open my mouth, but I cannot believe that that is what she's doing. And I think both of them could say it about each other. And that's the most interesting thing is like, why are you doing that? But they tamp it down. And I think what drives their friendship in a lot of ways is they are so different because they don't compete on a lot of levels. There's not a competition over how you raised your kids, how you took care of yourself. There's none of that because they're such different people. You know, you say that Virgil had this bigger piece in a novel and then pulled him back. So tell us about Virgil, because he is a big character in the story in his own way.
You see Virgil in Agnes's journals that she wrote from the period 1960 to 1963. She wrote them in the form of letters to her sister. Her sister's been dead for a while. But when Agnes is for the first time living alone through the winter at Fellowship Point and really no one's around, she starts writing this journal. And I loved writing it as thinking through her sister, because she didn't write exactly the same things that she would write if she were only writing a journal. You know, she really was addressing her sister, and her sister had been a very pure and high-minded person. So that kind of kept her on a certain path. But that first winter when she's living there, there's also a man living on Fellowship Point with his 3-year-old daughter. And he's the great nephew of the person who currently owns that particular house on the point. But that man has not invited him to stay in the house. He's invited him to stay in this little cabin, which has no insulation. You know, it has a wood stove, but it's just very rickety. And, you know, he's out there in the middle of the winter in Maine. But Agnes gets involved with him first out of anger because the child doesn't really speak very well. Mm-hmm. She hasn't had much language development, and Agnes understands that he doesn't really talk to her. Mm-hmm. You know, he's involved in his own stuff. He's not mean, but he doesn't watch her. He doesn't talk to her. He has no idea how to be with a child. So there's antagonism at first, but then it switches. You know, they're alone up there. She's older than he is, which she has some questions about, like, is that going to be a problem? But he, you know, he's very attractive, and once she cleans him up a little bit,
right, get that child talking, you know.
Go take a shower, talk to your kid,
right, and come back, and we'll see. You know, we'll see what happens. Was there one character that was easier to write than the others? I feel like Agnes was easy for you to write, but was she the easiest?
I don't know if anyone was easier. I think both Polly and Agnes were easy to write. I just had a great deal of feeling for both of them. And Maude reminded me so much of my students, the sort of millennials. Right. So that was easy for me to write too, because I'm around people. It's a little slightly earlier than the current crop of students, but I was very fascinated with the attitudes of the millennials and how much more assertive they were than I was. There's a part in the book that was hard to write, which was a letter exchange between Maude and Agnes. And Maude's being very confrontational. Maude's like in her 20s and Agnes is in her 80s. Agnes is very successful. Maude's just like, a junior, not even a junior editor, like an editorial assistant. She's writing to her in this very confrontational way. And I would write what Maude said and I would jump up from the desk like, I can't believe she's being this way. I can't even believe it. I would have never.
No.
So that was hard. But Agnes and Polly both were just, they just came so naturally to me.
Mm-hmm.
I've known types like both of them, more Pollys than Agneses, because there are not that many Agneses around, at least not in that generation. But I did know a couple who were the type of person that if you were on their good side, they were like the greatest person you knew.
Right.
If you got on their bad side, terrifying.
They could dissect with a look. They could just dissect you and you walk in the room and go, oh, I am just,
Exactly.
and you try to get yourself out of it. And there's that look that you're just getting in deeper and you can't get out of where you are and you're not getting there,
It's so perfect, Carol. Exactly. You must know those types.
And I was laughing at Maude because I remember when I first started out, I was the gopher, I was they called us rovers at Condé Nast. Like it was the intern program, but they called us rovers. And somebody said, could you help me get down to Penn Station with my luggage? This, editorial person or a marketing person. So I went with her and then I had to get back and I didn't know how to get back. I realized so I ran from Penn Station back to Madison and 44th, convinced that someone, even though this was the person I was reporting to, would miss me and have reported it upstairs. And I cannot picture anybody today caring two hoots about where they were. They would have stopped and got something to drink, done a little shopping, walked leisurely back and arrived 3 hours later and said, well, I went to Penn Station, And I'm like, why was I like that? Why did I do that?
I think everyone was like that for a long time. I certainly was like that. I was terrified of being 1 minute late back from lunch and, all of that.
We're going to get in trouble. It was just a really bad thing. Like, what was
exactly?
trouble?
It was in trouble.
Trouble. This is also a book about being a writer. So let's talk about Agnes as a writer, because I love that she's got two different careers. One a secret.
She wrote a book when she was 24 after a broken engagement, not quite an engagement, but a broken relationship that looked like it was going in that direction. She moved back home with her parents and she looked around at her friends, the girls she had known growing up, and they were all sliding into some form of compromise in their lives from the way she'd known them at school when they'd been just brilliant, interesting, energetic, had lots of hopes and dreams, even in that era. But now they've married people that she doesn't particularly think are great, or they've taken jobs where they're treated, not with a lot of respect, as women used to be treated in the workplace, and it's not over. It's different, but it's not over. And she writes a novel about these girls. It's sort of like The Group by Mary McCarthy.
Yes.
But it's a younger era, it's an earlier era, and she sends it to a publisher, and he says to her, you're never going to be able to show your face in Philadelphia again after you publish this book. So she decides to write it under a nom de plume. And she continues to write this series once every 10 years about where the girls are as they become women, as they become older women. And that's where she's having a writing block in that series. And she figures out why later in the book, but then she has this other career of children's books that are called the When Nan books, and they're all like when Nan was a lobsterman, when Nan went to Mount Everest, or just adventure books starring a 9-year-old girl.
Right.
That has been a source of income for her because she discovered that when she was 40, her lawyer told her, you're not going to be able to afford to keep Fellowship Point without more money. So it doesn't even think it occurred to her, like, maybe I should marry someone who has money. She's just like, no, I'm going to figure out how to make money.
Yeah.
So she does, but she's never told anyone that not even Polly, that she has this sort of financial pressure. And in her world, this is sort of treated as a hobby, not as like a serious career, which it is.
Right.
But I enjoyed writing her as a writer, and I enjoyed writing her a fantasy schedule, which I wish I had, of writing 5 hours a day without. It was more like Edith Wharton's schedule. I always loved Edith Wharton, like writing in bed and dropping the pages on the floor, and then having her maid come in and put the pages in order and put them on her desk. I was like, oh, that's amazing. So it was somewhere, it wasn't quite to that extent, but she wasn't writing in bed or anything, but it was sort of like having a whole morning alone without interruption. I mean, who has that? I have it here at this arts residency, but that's why I go to these places, because I can't get in that in real life.
No, you can't get in the zone. You can't get in the zone that's quite the same way. Real life gets in the way. The phone rings. Somebody's making noise outside. You have to go investigate what's going on. It's like a totally different thing.
Yeah.
But I love you talking about the children's books, because my younger son and I were having a talk about it this weekend, because we remember my driving him to Borders at the time and buying him one of those Magic Treehouse books. And they're only about like this thick. And he gets home and he goes, done. And I was like, okay, that was $4.95. And we only drove 20 minutes. And I said, we're now discovering the library. And when I thought about this series of books, I said, I could just see them all lined up in order in the library. This is the series books that you're going to want to read. And I had a good laugh about that, rereading this,
That's funny. I was thinking about that too, like the Nancy Drew, these were more for younger children because they were picture books. But yes, the series that you would just take, and if one was missing, or that you would collect them. There is a plot in the book about a woman who had read them as a child and read them to her child. I mean, she knew about them and she read them to her child. That's like, I don't even want to talk about that too much because it's too much of a spoiler, but we're definitely devoted fans to that series.
Yeah. And it's funny because I have them all in boxes in the attic for the someday grandchildren. Like, wait, my boys are 28 and 33. We're nowhere close to grandchildren, but I even have the Hank the Cowdog series, including on cassette as well as in books. And it's funny how you get these things and you feel like, I can't give them away. They were such a big part of my children's childhood.
I have the same thing. I have boxes of my son's books for if. Now I'm saying if. It used to be when he has children. Now I'm saying, who knows?
Either we'll have to invite some child over to read them. We'll create a little library room and the children can come over and they can check out whatever they want and maybe keep it, because
that's a great idea. Yeah.
There's a lot. But she doesn't even tell Polly. She keeps this part of herself quiet, even from Polly. And I think it's like more than the money. It's more like she's talking about how women feel in these books. And she almost doesn't want to hear Polly's opinion about this. It's like my writing, my coming out. Am I right on that, on why she may be feeling that way?
I think there's a lot of truth to what you say about it. I think it's a place of real freedom for her, and that she doesn't have anywhere else in her life, even though she is quite free because she has enough money and a nice space. She has all kinds of privilege, but she's still a woman, and there's still so many restrictions on women like her. And even, she wants to be free to say shocking things in these books or to portray these women critically. And they're in the world of Polly and Agnes. Agnes goes to dinner parties where people are talking about the books, as people used to do at dinner parties.
Right. 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 Remember that? Yeah. Remember conversation?
People would have, there's an era when people would have all read this book
Right.
and be able to talk about it at a party. That doesn't exist anymore. But, and she hears what people say. I think she just doesn't want to impose the secret on Polly. That's a big part of it, because Polly would have to keep the secret from Dick. She doesn't want to put that pressure on Polly, because Polly would feel torn and disloyal. But she also wants to maintain this space where she can do what she wants and not have to worry about potentially hurting Polly's feelings by writing a plot line or something that might bother her.
And it might feel like Polly said, "Are you writing about me?" And
yes,
it may or may not be, but Polly would intuit that it was about her.
Exactly.
That would be
of
hurtful.
course, there are shades of Polly in the book. There's no Polly character, but it's just the way it is, because it's a type, it's a group, it's their milieu.
It's
So
the way Polly is.
Yeah.
It's the way Polly is, for for better or for worse. And Polly keeps a secret from Agnes about having this miscarriage that really stayed with her. It really stayed with her. And one of the reasons was she so wanted a girl. She wanted a girl in her life. And it was so interesting, because you think she's a mother and but you realize there was still something missing, and it was a big missing for her. And I thought, reading that part, it was, wow, this is what you're carrying with you. And you didn't tell anybody about what was going on. And I found that so interesting. It was her own secret, her own holding back on something.
Yeah, she had a couple of miscarriages. She had 3 sons, and then she wanted a girl all along. I think she wanted a companion. She wanted, even though she has Agnes, she wanted someone to pass all her skills along to.
Right.
This is how you arrange flowers. This is how you set a table. This is how she has this huge skill set, as people did in her era. And her boys, they're not going to learn that stuff.
No.
They're going to marry someone who knows that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was very heartbreaking to her, to go through miscarriage. And then after a particular child was born, Dick says to her, "No more children." And that was really devastating, because then she had to keep her secret that she was still going to try to have a child. She had to keep it from him too.
Right.
So she does have an equal private life, but it's in the arena of creativity, of having children.
Yeah.
Rather
it's maternal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I also do love when the daughters-in-law come up. They have all their mix masters and KitchenAid, and they're all in the cabinets. And then when they come out, all the stuff is on her counters, and she doesn't like everything on her counter. And if she had a daughter, she'd be saying, "Oh, isn't it great? We keep everything in the cupboard." And it was one of those really telling moments, because I think that every family can say this. If you all get together and you go down to the beach for a week, it's portrayed as being some idyllic time, but that there's some daughter-in-law upstairs going, "Are you kidding? Are you kidding that we're doing this?" I mean, really?
Absolutely.
And everybody goes downstairs and acts happy. And then the next day, somebody goes out sailing for the whole day, just not to be around everybody, and shows up later. And I just felt like there's this beatific, oh, this is everyone's coming. And there's the ideal of what it's going to be. And then it's what it is when they get there. And how the sons can be cruel, especially the one son. And I just think it was so interesting, because she's got this idea in her head about what this is going to be. And then they get there. It's
every year she has that idea in her head. And they keep giving her, fancy kitchen appliances that she never uses. Yeah, she does keep them in the basement, in the cabinets, until then she pulls them out. But she realizes, she understands they're buying it for themselves, because they don't want to do things the way she does them, which is fairly simple and old-fashioned. But yeah, all of those things happen. People leave for the day. There's tension. There's, it's not easy.
No, it's not easy. Years ago, we used to rent a house on the Outer Banks, and we do love to cook. So we brought a mini food processor down. And for weeks, months, when we come back, I'm looking for the mini food processor, and we realized we left it in the house down there.
Oh, no.
So I said, what we'll just do? we'll rent the house again. And we did. It's sitting right on the counter. And I said, like, I hope they realize this is really ours and we'll take it back. But it was so funny. It was this one thing that we had to bring. I mean, we used to bring like good knives. We had all these rules because we like to cook. But I could just picture these people in the house. She's like, oh, let's go get everything out. They're coming back again.
Yeah,
and that's their life.
Exactly.
You're melding lives.
So I love that story about renting the house to get your Cuisinart or whatever.
Well, we used to be down at Christmas too, and we actually stored this artificial tree in the people's attic. They said, well, just leave it. You come back every year. And they sold the house. And written into the rental agreement is there is a tree in the attic that the Fitzgeralds will come and get at Christmas. And I was like, wow, we're part of selling the house. You know, I just love this.
That's great. That's so great.
Yeah, it's like staying with them. So Maude's come up with New York to work with Agnes on a book. And she's got these ideas. And you said she's a millennial. She's super excited about everything. What's she like as this character that comes in and it's like a whirlwind of this is what we should do. And it's going to be so great.
Maude's a really interesting character to me because I didn't know this was going to happen, but she's actually the person who creates a change in Agnes. She has the idea to get Agnes to write a memoir. Mm-hmm. And she thinks Agnes has all these fans. They want to know, who was Nan a real child? How did Agnes create her? How did she write these books? So she asks she asks Agnes to write a memoir, and Agnes resists, but then she finally sits down and writes one. And it's nothing like what Maude wanted from her. It's just, it's this very sort of lyrical, beautiful portrait of what it was like to grow up on Fellowship Point in the summers with her siblings and Polly's siblings and other children and play all day. And Maude's like, what? I mean, yes, it's beautiful, but this is not what your fans are looking for. Right. They want, they want the behind the scenes on these books. So this is like a real tussle between them. And to me, it's one of my favorite relationships in the book between the two of them, because they're a good match for each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In some ways better than Polly and Agnes, because Maude is also, she's a lot like Agnes. She's taking care of her mother. She's taking care of a daughter as without a partner. She's trying to make her way in the world. She's not a particularly tough person, but she's tough out of circumstantial reasons. She has to be tough. So they're both tough, and they meet their match in each other, and it changes both of them. Mm-hmm. They both become different people because of the struggle they go through with each other. And I really loved writing that relationship.
Mm-hmm. The push and pull, and I'm going to make this better, and I'm already where I want to be. But she sees something in her too. She's seeing, well, would that have been me if I had a child? Would that would have been me if I was struggling with both parts of my life, the yin and the yang, which I never did. I never was worrying about somebody else quite the same way she has to,
Yeah. Agnes has sort of surrogate children in the book, emotionally. Mm-hmm. She has Robert Circumstance, who's a well-known landscape architect in Maine, but he was the son of the caretaker on Fellowship Point, so he still serves as the caretaker for Fellowship Point. Mm-hmm. So he has a sort of a grandfathered relationship with Agnes and Polly, and he's known them his whole life, but she's helped him in a number of ways. She sent him to boarding school, she sent him to college, she helped him out of a legal situation, and she doesn't overstep her bounds because she doesn't want to intrude on his, sense of independence and self-respect. So she doesn't tell him what to do, but she's sort of there. Mm-hmm. And she does the same thing with Maude, except with Maude, she gets into it a little more. She's older. Maude's a little tough. I think she felt a little more tentative about dealing with someone else's child when the mother was right there. She knew the mother really well. The mother was the cook at Fellowship Point for her parents. But Maude's sort of a free, Maude needs a mother, really, or maybe a grandmother in this case, because she's that much older than her. But she does have that sort of feeling towards these two people. She's very maternal, which I didn't think about when I was first writing about her, but it slowly developed that she has a really powerful maternal feeling. And, I thought, is it too bad that she didn't have children? But you can't even really think that way. Our lives go as they go. And she found ways to express that part of her personality.
I felt that she was like the mother robin sitting on top of the eggs, but then they're going to go their own way. They're going to go do their own thing. It's not like the robin family stays together forever.
No, exactly.
And I felt like that was what was going on. And even at the beginning, like she's trying to rescue Robert. Like, it's like, I've got to go take care of this situation. And she likes being in that position.
She does.
But she likes being able to help. She likes being able to be in charge in a way that she can help people. And she doesn't see it like Polly is, because Polly's helping people she has to, because they're her children. There's a different DNA going on there.
It's quite different.
Yeah. So Maine, especially the area of Fellowship Point, is like a character in the book. And there's a backstory on it of, as well as where it is and what it may look like later. So is there a real Fellowship Point? Is there really a place? No. Okay.
No, I totally made it up. And it really got made up through the characters. As I said, Virgil goes over to this place. So I had one house there, and then Polly came into my mind. So then there was, so it built that way. And then I finally drew a map of like where all these houses were in relation to each other. Yes, there's a map in the book.
And I just loved it because
I love that they included a map.
I was following through where all the people were. I was like, oh, look, and it's this great. Is this the map you drew, or is this a different map?
I drew a rough map like that, but then a man who is a professional digital map maker took my little sketch and made it into something much more legible.
But you have to have it, because you're seeing the points of where did they go? How far were these places from each other? Because it plays in at different points in the book. What would you have seen and what you would not have seen? And I think that that's, a really big point. And Fellowship Point is its own character in the book as well, because it's this place that, like an adopted child, is in this push-pull of who's going to get it, like who's going to edit. So tell us a little bit.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, what tell us about that, what's happening at the point at this moment. These families are in the history of it a little bit.
So Fellowship Point was founded by Agnes's great-great-grandfather, who took a trip one year to Maine because he had heard a lecture by Thoreau who said Maine is the last wilderness on the East Coast. So that immediately attracted him. I've got to go visit. Of course, there were parts of Maine like Bar Harbor and all that were quite already social and developed, but there was a lot that was just raw. So he found this place just by riding his horse along, and he rode down this peninsula, and he loved it so much that he bought it. And then he brought a few friends the next summer, and they just went, there was nothing there. They just went as a few men just camping. But then his brother, who has much more business ambition and all kinds of ambition than William, said this would make a great summer place for us. And anyway, so William decides that he's going to buy it he's going to share it with 5 families, and they all put in money to build these houses. And he went back and forth a lot of times. It was fun thinking about it because I did a lot of reading about utopian communities and how they were founded and how the bylaws were made. And Fellowship Point was made so that no one could sell their house unless 3 people agreed to break the point agreement. 3 out of the 5. One person in each family inherited the house from one generation to the next. So there would always be 5 people who owned it unless that family somehow died out. So that's where they are at this time. There's 3 people who still own it. Agnes Polly and Agnes's nephew, who's coming down from the line of her great-grandfather's brother. So those are the three people who have to decide whether or not to break the point agreement. There's a part on the point that they call the sank, short for sanctuary, which was one of William Lee's first ideas about the point. He noticed certain birds there that weren't even supposed to be there. And he realized it was such a protected area that it would attract that kind of bird activity. So ever since 1870, 74 or 5, when he started coming there in the summer, that's been completely protected land. There's nothing there. They never even, there's sort of a tacit agreement. We're not even telling anybody about this because we want it to be the equivalent of a bird sanctuary. So it's kept very pristine. There's golden eagle's nest that's decades old and other amazing things. There's also on that sank part of the land, there's an old Indian camp where the Abenaki used to come for summer. They come down from the north, down the rivers into, the coast of Maine have a summer camp. So there's artifacts there that they've collected over the years as they, in the spring, how things come up from the earth.
Yes.
They've collected things like that. They've done a little digging, but not a lot because they don't want to, they're not trying to pillage this. It's just like something that's there. So they have a collection of artifacts and cases in the house. People have asked to buy them, museums and so on, but they feel like they can take care of them perfectly well. So that's another back of the mind interest in this piece of land. It's like other people were here before. And, and so at a certain point that becomes part of the plot.
And the land is a character. It's a really big character in the novel, going back to the 1870s when this blocks of land were bought up, and what happened along the way with the Quakers and what happened along the way with the families that were living on this property. So then there's the land trust, and now we've got developers scouting the land, as developers seem to sniff out every. I drove down the street the other day and I was like, wait, why are the trees all gone in this area? And it's like, oh, the farm on the other side backed up and somebody bought the house, but sold off the land. And now there are going to be 2 more houses there. And when we moved here, I was like, there weren't this many houses. And we also have this crazy thing in New Jersey where you have to do, I think you're from New Jersey. So you might
I live in Montclair.
Yeah. Okay. So we live out more, and I grew up in Cedar Grove, actually. And it's really funny because we sit there and now it's all about, we have to have affordable housing in all these towns. But in order to build affordable housing, the developers are building these huge developments for the affordable housing that they're going to rent for or give or whatever to people over here. And every single piece of land, it seems like there are these large apartment complexes going up on right now. And I'm like, who is going to be living in all of these places?
Yeah.
And starting at $700,000 or $1 million. And I'm
so crazy.
It is, but
it's out in the country.
But we have to do it.
There.
I think I read somewhere in Montclair they were building it by the train station. They were going to build this whole development down there in this very quaint, very beautiful part of town. And you're like, well, honestly, but it's every appeal. So when I was reading this, I was thinking about every available plot of land. It's like developers can hone in it, like the vultures of we're going to come in and we're going to do this. And it's everybody has to decide what they're going to do. Polly's got sons, and one son is giving her a terrifically hard time because he's got this sense of entitlement that this will be something that he will be able to have.
It's going to come to him. He would be the next in line. And so he has no interest in this land trust idea. Also, you see him hobnobbing with the developers. The developers are local people that Agnes and Polly have known. They've known the older one. Now there's sons who have taken over the business. They know these people, and they have never had a high opinion of these people. They've always sort of been a menace. So it's just like, it's like there's the golden, there's the nice birds, and then there's the vultures circling,
Right.
ready to move in,
Yeah.
ready to move in and make it a marina resort. That's the idea.
Yeah. And I love that Polly just gets her back up. I mean, we finally see Polly stand up to her son and go like, this is like my decision. You're out of it. And it was so much fun to see Polly take on this edge that,
I
whoa,
know.
where'd that come from, girl? You know?
I know. It was, well, it's after she becomes a widow. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that's much of a spoiler
No,
because,
no, no. Yeah.
but it's after she becomes a widow. She has more space in her life. She
Mhm.
doesn't have to run home. Like there's a line that says that when she and Agnes get together every afternoon, and there's a moment when she like hears a bell inside her head, like time time to go back to Dick. She doesn't have that bell anymore. It's
Right.
gone.
Right.
And then she really comes into her own in a few major ways. And one of them is that, her sons say, well, this is a lot for you to take care of. Well, we'll take over. You go move to one of these, a place.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
It's my house. Go away.
Yeah. Just go away and take your appliances with you while you go. Please take your appliances. So, there's so many threads and storylines here, and they'll keep you turning the pages, and each is completely fleshed out and developed. I take it there was not an outline. You just were writing. So you end up with, I think I read 800 pages. There were some and then
it's more than that. I had 1,400 pages or 1,600 pages at some point. Just because I wrote a lot, there's a lot I cut.
Right.
For example, the child who's living on the point in the 1860s, something happens and she has to leave and move in with a relative. And I had her whole story, like what happens to her. I had a lot about Robert has a moment when he is imprisoned for something that it was bogus, but I had his whole, being in prison. So I wrote a lot of scenes that I loved them. I mean,
right.
but I had to winnow it down to exactly what was important to this particular storyline.
I always think when you're really involved in a book, as I was with this one, it'd be really fun to go to the author's website and go, okay, here's a little more about Robert. Because I did write all these words. I wrote all of this stuff and I really did a good job on it. And then, wait, there's this other little piece. And it's a way I feel to keep readers, A, involved in the story, and B, understanding the writer who, actually wrote 600 more pages than what they saw, seeing how this came together, where these parts were not really necessary. And I always think when I'm doing these interviews, it's all this stuff that what made the writer take that out, besides conversations with the editor and their agent or whatever. And I think that whole thought process for you who somebody who's taught writing or whatever is just so interesting to say, here's more, here's a little bit extra.
Yes, yeah, maybe I should do that. I definitely had a lot of events over the past year where people have said, please, can we read that part? Please, can we read that part? Right. So, maybe I should just take a month and make sure those pieces are in good order and put them on my website. Because it is a shame to just let them languish in the computer.
Right. And, the part of me, we build websites. So I always think about this is there's a newsletter and we're going to tell you that there's a new chapter up that you can go take a look at. And you just get people more involved. And you're also setting up whatever you're going to do next, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I always think those parts are so much fun. There was someone who wrote a thriller a couple of years ago, and there was an alternate ending. And for a group of independent booksellers, the alternate ending was available in their stores when you did a pre-order. And it was so interesting to me because everybody was wondering what would the alternate ending be. I mean, I had them send it to me because I was dying to see. But to hear the whole process of you thought the book ended like this. And I think that those of us who really love books, we also love the craft of writing. And you're interested to see, how did it get to be this? What more do you know about the character? Oh, you don't really need to know, but isn't it fun to know that part? I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm totally fascinated, and I love seeing writers' drafts. When you can see a draft. I actually, speaking of alternate endings, this had an alternate ending, when I first, well, it was actually typed, it was already set in pages.
Wow.
I just felt like this ending is not the right ending for the book. It's not what I want. So I went back. It really ended, well, I won't say.
Right.
Even if I say that, it's too close to the ending. But let's say the last maybe 40 pages were a new ending. And now I love the ending. And when I finished that ending, I felt like, okay, the book is finished. A lot of people ask me, like, do you miss writing about these characters? I'm like, but I got to the finish, I finished, I rounded it off. I have thought about writing about them when they were younger. The original opening of the book, the first chapter was seeing them when they were 14, and an incident where the person who turns out to be the developer kills one of the birds on the property. And I loved that because you saw what their families were like. You saw their fathers when they were young. You got a view of the point at that moment. I have thought about putting that up on my web. Yeah, I'll do it, Carol.
It's all these
Thank
fun
you.
kinds of things. It's all these really fun kinds of things, because I think that the book is in 6 parts, and the last is actually the shortest, if I remember correctly. And I love that I look at things like the chapter titles. I look at the year that's there. Think about what the year was actually like, what people were going through. And then I'm also thinking about these 6 parts of the book. And at what point does it become 6 parts? And is that 6th part the one that was like that you said, oh, we got to jigger this around at the end. I think I've got a better ending. And I think that when we read these days, we read, and we don't discuss books when we go out to dinner. We do them in book clubs, but a book club may be daunted by reading a book this size. I hear a lot of book clubs go, oh, it's including mine, it's got to be under 400 pages but they miss the chance to really delve deep into the whole writing process and where it all comes together. I think that's the reason I love doing these interviews, because I'm trying to see and draw into that dinner party conversation that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, I have a lot of book clubs have actually read this book. It's, I think the way you described that you read it slowly, savoring the language. A lot of people have reflected that to me, but I've also heard I read it in 2 days because it was such a page turner. So I don't think it's like a very dense, hard to read long book. It's a fairly, if you want to read it at a clip, you can.
Absolutely. But
I do agree with you that it is really fascinating how these decisions are made. And I think I also love to look at writers' notebooks who really keep careful notes of how they make decisions as they're going along. And I've been trying to do more of that myself. I used to do it pretty faithfully, but I didn't do it enough with Fellowship Point, because there's times when I wish I could go back and read how I did it. In fact, there was one summer I was working on the book, got to the end of the summer, made all these notes about where I was. And then I did my semester, and then I picked it up, first day of winter break, picked up the book again. And I read the notes. I was like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. These are like, they're written in such shorthand, because I was so familiar with the book that the notes I wrote, they didn't translate over a few months of not looking at it. They were sort of written as if I were going back to it the next day. So I've learned to be a little more generous in my note writing to myself, really spell it out.
This is what I may say. I write a newsletter that goes out every Friday night, and there's sometimes I write a note. I send them in drafts in the news, in my mail all week. And I'm like, what was that? What was I talking about? Like,
exactly.
And it's like, I agree with you. You just got to be a little bit more explicit in what you're doing.
Yeah.
Now you teach the MFA writing program at Rutgers. You do it in the fall or the spring, or what season? Both. Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you love about teaching? What do you love about?
Oh, well, first, of course, the students. I love the students. I've been doing it for the program, I guess this has been like 13 or 14 years, but I've been teaching at Rutgers for 20 years. And I had master's students before the MFA program started. They've changed a lot over these last X amount of years. The world has changed so fast, and the young people have changed radically over that time in certain ways. In certain ways, they're just young people. But I love talking to them because it's just it's exactly what you were just reflecting of. Most of us read alone now. And we don't have the opportunity to have like deep discussions about literature. It's hard to organize that. Even in a book club, I feel the conversations are fast sometimes, and they can go into, they can digress a lot from really focusing on the book. In my program, since I'm the teacher, I can keep the focus. It doesn't go anywhere that I don't really think it should go. And this spring, I had the best teaching experience ever. I taught all 4 of the Neapolitan novels to a 6-person seminar. Well, I was the 7th person. So that was a ton of reading in 3 months. And every week we all wrote in a Google Doc, like our responses to the reading. And that just enhanced the reading incredibly, because people came from very different angles to talk about what their response was. Some of it was very personal. Some of it was like really great literary criticism, but it was so inspiring and exciting. I felt like this is the way you really should read books. You really should read them with other people, but it has to be a little more directed than a lot of book groups are, I think.
It's got to be this really quality kind of experience. This quality kind of experience of going on. You have ideas going in my head, by the way, about what to do with this book. You've got some ideas. We do this Bookachino live book group every month, but you got me thinking in some other directions as well. Really, it's interesting too, because when I was in college, I like to take the classes. I didn't like to go to class, to be perfectly honest. I like to do the class where you read a book a week, you wrote a paper on it, and then you went and discussed it. And I did one on books that changed America and the books about the 60s. And I would go to those classes. I'd never not read the book. I'd always want to write a paper about it, even if it wasn't a book I loved, because there was going to be that spur of conversation. And I think I agree with you. That's what's missing a lot in this conversation, where I'd walk away with different opinions about things than I actually had before, because I was open up to hear what other people had to say.
Exactly. I really think pre-writing and actually forcing yourself to put your thoughts in words before you go into a book group meeting is amazing. I think it would be very hard to, you'd have to have a very particular group of people who were willing to do that. But it makes the conversation at a much higher level. And you read each other's. I mean, we all read each other's on the Google Doc before we came into the room. So that was wonderful. I also think something that doesn't even happen in college, and it doesn't happen in book groups very much, is reading the work of one author. Because like you're saying, figuring out how the author does it and how they make decisions. Like just reading this Neapolitan novel, which is really 2,000 pages, and not her shorter books or anything. By the end of it, you really see like her writing changes a lot over the course of those 2,000 pages. You see her figuring things out and using more complex techniques and finding more interesting ways to tell certain parts of the story. And it's really fascinating. So I think if you're interested in the craft, like choosing a few books by one author and seeing how they develop or what is repeated, it's very illuminating.
What you're thinking about, I was thinking about, adult school. People used to go to adult school and learn pottery or stuff like that. And I don't know if there's adult schools right now where you would go in and read books like this and have that same kind of experience. But I think people have time. I mean, people have more time than they think, like, to do things. If you really want to do it, you make the time. And, it took me 2 weeks also because I was like running a company, that thing that I have to do, like, during the week. Yes, but it's interesting to sit there and say, is there a group of people that would want to have this deep level of intellectual conversation? And are we calling ourselves short because we're just doing certain things these days? I mean, I remember there was, Montclair had adult schools and things like that. And I'm just wondering if those even exist right now.
I
And what are we
think,
doing as courses,
I think that Montclair did have an adult school, and I think the pandemic
Yeah.
did away with it, and I'm not sure it's come back yet.
Yeah. And, the pandemic did away with so many things. We have, one of my cousins had this great idea or an imagery about it is we had a lot of things in our basket, and the basket got completely empty. And what's going back in your basket? And exactly what I thought was going to happen is happening this summer is international travels through the roof. And there was like scales. You first went and saw your family, then you went and saw like distant friends, you went to your favorite location, and now you're traveling to like Egypt because you haven't been there,
Right.
So I don't know. So your students seem like they're inspiring to you as well, because you're hearing the way they think and hearing how they talk.
They really are inspiring. I like to see them develop too. It's the same thing, I'm watching them develop. But they also, a lot of them they're graduate students. A lot of them did English as undergrads, and I didn't. So, and also I went to college a while back, and they've learned different kinds of literary criticism and literary theory that they can bring into a conversation that I really love. I don't know all that stuff. I know it superficially, but I don't know it as someone who studied it as their major. And, they bring a lot of different perspectives. And they just want to talk about writing. A lot of times when I get together with my writer friends, it's like the business of writing.
Yes.
Or what's going on, with your editor, your agent, which is also important and necessary. But sometimes you don't get to, what you really crave, just talking about the actual writing. So it's sort of a captive audience to talk about that, which I really loved. I think I've gotten to be such a better writer because I spent a lot of years figuring out how to teach writing, really learning how it worked. Like, how do you make a good plot? How do you do, not just like, my husband went to grad school in writing before I did, or differently than I did, I should say. And his teachers would just say, well, I don't know how I do it. I just do it. And I was like, that is not good enough. You really have to figure out how to help people and just give them the tools, and then they'll figure it out themselves from there. But I really worked hard on knowing how to explain and express the tools, the craft tools. And that was so good for me. Because I could have ended up just being like an intuitive writer or trial and error writer. But now I actually understand a lot about what I'm doing. And I don't think about it when I'm drafting, but when I go back and start revising, then I'm like, I bring all of that in. And it's so useful.
Well, I think it's also useful to hear this was 1,400 pages, then it was 800, then it moved. It doesn't have to be exactly what it is. It's going to get you to another point. Because I think when you go up against a wall, once you've gotten up against the wall and gotten away from the wall, when you had 2 years you weren't writing or something like that, and you realize, oh, I can do this again at some point. I mean, I have so many author friends that say, I don't know if I can write another book. I'm sure I'm never going to be able to write something, but it'll come. It'll come if you give it the time to germinate and figure it out. And I agree that writers these days are talking about the business of writing, because the business has changed so much, even since I started this company almost 27 years ago. With the internet, with what you're supposed to be doing on social and this and that and the other thing. By the time you get finished at the end of a day of what's going on of the business side of it, the creative side's got to have enough room to move against the business. And everybody's talking about, what's this happening? Are they doing this for you? Are they doing that? Whereas before it used to be way back. Did you get reviewed? Where did you get reviewed? Did you go on tour? Maybe you didn't even do that. Think how much it's changed.
It's, social media has changed everything. And there's just so much opportunity or, necessity for authors to promote. That didn't happen. That didn't used to happen at all. There was no, there was a lot of mystery about marketing and promotion. As an author, you didn't know how they did it, what they were doing. Now you know a lot more because you're part of it. But it's sort of endless. I mean, you could spend your whole life doing it. if you wanted to.
Right. And you're right. Well, what reward? Like what? And look, I'm always doing this with the website as well. If I put up something that I'm doing for the time that I'm going to do that, is it worth it to be doing that or be doing something else? And you're constantly worrying about risk versus reward all day long. And
it's true.
You weren't doing that back at the beginning. You weren't, 27 years ago. And it sounds like ions ago at this point of what people were expected to do. And also it's the ramp up. Also, we used to have at the beginning, we would type for authors and they go, well, he's not really good at talking. Well, these days, you can't not be good at talking about your book. It's such an important thing to be able to go out and do that. Whereas before, there were people that just wrote and that you were never going to put them on anything because they were never going to be able to speak. I mean, it just changed so much, so much.
It has changed a lot. And I think there's a certain kind of, not only older authors, but definitely some older authors who still think that they can do that.
Yeah.
And it's just okay, but there's a whole world that's moving pretty quickly out there that you're not even on that treadmill at all.
Right.
I do think, having had this book out for almost a year now, I have been able to assess what works and what doesn't work for this book, where it's my energy is well spent and where it's not going to make any difference. But I think that's hard too. It's trial and error because you don't really know who your audience is until the book has been out for a while. For example, I don't know why, but it never occurred to me that 80-year-olds would love this book. And they do. I mean, I've got tons of letters from women saying, thank you so much for writing a book about active, involved, growing, changing 80-year-olds, instead of having a grandmother pass through the background.
Yeah.
But that didn't even occur to me. I just thought of them as characters. I didn't think of them as potential identity, characters for people, but it has been, and that's been amazing for me. I love it. So then I can think about that more, like how to reach more people who might feel an identity with the book, not just read it as a book,
Right. And, it's interesting because we have somewhat of an older audience and people say, oh, we're looking for young people to replace, the older people. And I'm saying, you're talking to people that are 45 plus who have a lot more time on their hands than younger people. I mean, younger people, there are young children. There are, I remember there were years that I didn't have time for the reading that I'd like to do just because I had so many other responsibilities. But now there are people that is what their joy is having time to read. And we hear from people all the time about that. And I can see
it's absolutely true. And the letters they write me, their thoughts about the book are so sophisticated.
Yes.
They're really, really, really good readers. And I think there's a huge audience out there that is not being marketed to with the potential. The potential has not been at all mined. And, I hate to say it that way because that sounds very crass, but it's true. I think those people could be taken into consideration a lot more. I say those people. I'm getting there myself. I'm getting there.
But it's also, people go to the library, they don't buy books. Well, it's also because you don't need any more possessions. I mean, people get to the point where they just don't need any more stuff around. And I've also been at a lot of book festivals and they say, oh, the book sales over here. And I said, but how about the person who wanted the audiobook and just sat in the audience and bought it? What about the person who wanted the ebook and sat in the audience and bought it? And I was down at the Charleston Book Festival and my friend bought a book for the author because she knew that was the right thing to do. She handed it to me and she says, you can give this to somebody. She says, because I'm never going to read a print book. I'll download the audio. And it was, whoa, what, and I say to book festivals, either figure out how to have the bookseller sell the audio, like with a little, barcode or something. Either that or just look at how many you sold that week that you might be, the person that was helping move the books. Because people read in all different ways.
True, because every so often I look at my author portal and see where the sales are, and so many ebooks.
Right.
And then I was, someone said, well, that's what old people buy. They all have a Kindle or an iPad. and they read there because they, they, like you said, they don't want to buy more objects to bring into their life at this stage.
And they also get from the library. They'll get from, and libraries, a couple of libraries told me, because I do a lot of library events where I'll go talk about previews events of whatever. And they say to me, oh, Carol, it's really interesting. People aren't coming in the same way since the pandemic because they learned they could get the ebook. I was like, really interesting,
they
folks.
can get it online from the library.
So was Fellowship Point always the title?
It was always the title. And when when my editor first looked at it, she said, oh, we're keeping that title. And I was like, really?
Yeah.
That's so great. Because I think I had a list of other possible titles because I was so expecting to be told, no, we don't like that title. But no.
Was this always the cover?
Title.
Was this always the cover?
No, I had a different cover that I had picked, which was an Alex Katz painting that I love. It's in the Farnsworth Museum in Maine. But there was a shift from one imprint to another imprint. And when it went to imprint over at Scribner, Mary Sue Rucci it was with her the whole time. But when it went over, they picked this new cover. This is actually a photograph that Mary Sue had taken when she was in Maine. Yeah. And then they sort of colorized it a little bit. I love it.
It's great. Yeah, no, it definitely sets the mood. It definitely sets the mood.
It does. Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, okay, but the audio is narrated by Cassandra Campbell. Was that your selection for the audio?
Yes, I had a few choices, and I always love, there's certain readers I love, and if I see that she read a book, it really does influence me. So yeah, I haven't even listened to it yet, if you can believe it, but.
I can believe, been a little busy. For those who are listening to the podcast, we'll have a sample of the audio at the end. And then, okay, now you wrote a story called Into the Gloaming years ago that I confess I have not read, but most reviewers cite this, which means I should have really read this before we talked today because I feel like I didn't do my homework or some such thing. And it was clearly a seminal piece that was not made into just, now let's just talk about books these days. It's like, is it a movie? This is not just one, folks. This is two. So this is like, really a seminal piece. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it leads into what you're working on next.
It does. Yes. So it's a story about a young man who has AIDS. It's in the mid 80s, and he goes home to his parents' house to die. And it's really a story of he and his mother every late afternoon in the gloaming meet and talk. And it's a relationship that they've never had before with each other. It's also an opportunity for her to speak deeply in a way that she never totally has. And it's an opportunity for him to say last things. And it's really a two-person piece. I'm telling you, when people started calling me about movie rights, I was like, you've got to be kidding. I mean, at most, this would be like a black box two-hander. It's not going to be, it's not a movie. But what did I know?
Short story, folks, yeah.
What did I know? I mean, HBO made it, and then Trinity Playhouse, which is in Manhattan, it's part of Trinity Church. They have a really good arts unit, and they sort of make stories with inspirational content, and they did a really nice version of it. But I talk about how things have changed. When that happened, and I would tell people it was going to be made into whatever, sometimes people would say, congratulations. And I'd be like, really? I mean,
is that a big deal? Really?
Really? I mean, I wrote it as a story. If I wanted to write a movie, I would have written a movie. I just like now that's even that thought. I don't think anyone has that thought. No. I think it's like, how fast can I sell it to the movies?
Exactly. Hopefully before the book comes out. Let's do that first.
Exactly.
Maybe before it's even finished. I remember that's what happened with The Firm years ago. That was there was going to be a movie before the book even came out. So
yeah,
we've reached just this new level of what is a success. I mean, it's just completely, I don't know. And that's the reason that when you just sit down and read this, folks, this is the reading of the book, and it's just beautiful. So next are you continuing the story of Into the Glove?
Yes. So I am continuing with those characters after the new book opens at his funeral, actually. And you don't have to have read the story because, whatever was in that story, I give enough of a glance of. But it goes forward for 35 years. It goes up to the present, really.
Mm.
And it's really how does life go on after someone who is so important and a young person. He was 33, a young person. How do you live with that kind of a loss? How do you build a life after that loss? How do you remember him? And what, all of the complicated feelings of grief that people have. And there's also an element in the book of his mother still thinks she's in contact with him in certain ways. And his sister wants to be, so there's just a lot of things that people do under circumstances of grief. But then it's also their lives, because their lives go on.
Right.
So and I read a lot about the sister in the new book. In the story, she has one line. She comes and visits him. I mean, it's literally one line.
One line.
So I really felt like the sister got short shrift. She needs more page space. So, and I love those characters. I really loved them. So it's fun to be back in that. I also get to write more about him because in that story, he is at the end of his life, and he was, the most beautiful man in New York. And now he's, he's not. I mean, so I get to go back to his heyday and his life, which is interesting because he had a very spiritual life. He was considering becoming a monk. He was in a monastery for a while. So I get to write about certain questions of faith and all of those things, which I don't know, they're interesting to me. So.
Well, when you think about when the 80s, we used to say we weren't going to a funeral a week. I mean, because I was in the arts business, and you think about all the talent that was lost. Like,
unbelievable.
You think about, okay, so you go back to World War II, and like I always say, did the person that was going to cure cancer die in a battlefield someplace? And then down here was the person that was going to do X. What happened to them? And we had a whole sheaf of creators that was spurred the next generation of creators. It's gone. That was annihilated. And I think about that a lot, of the people that are gone and what at the time it was designers, it was artists, it was the whole communities of people that were just bereft.
Just wiped out.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. It was, it was truly, it was not only a pandemic, it was like an erasure.
Yeah.
It was really so devastating. It's hard to even explain to people because we just went through a big pandemic, but you didn't see it the same way you did there. I mean, you really saw it happening. You saw it on the street. You saw it everywhere. And with just no help. I mean, Trump giving 20 billion, I forget how much to develop a vaccine. It was the opposite.
Right.
It was like, let them die. I mean, it was so bad.
And it was a political situation. It was a social situation. It was a medical situation. It was like everything rolled up in one. And the contagious of what this was, and how could you get it? And I don't know. It was just
for a while.
Yeah. Nobody knew what was going on, and nobody knew nobody was coming together. People were going further apart as a result. And I think that it's interesting now because we're finally able to write about the 70s and the 80s as history and have this moment to be able to take that step back that you really couldn't do in the 90s even. You needed the time to pull back and look at what this whole thing was like and what it could have been, like where these people could have been at this point. And I don't know, I find it fascinating that these are finally times we're talking about in different ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I lived in those times, and it's really hard to explain what it was like, especially the 70s. Before, before certain things, before there was any computer situation.
Yes.
before there was a certain kind of conservatism, that has taken over and gone into extreme pockets. Not just the old kind of, like my grandfather was like a Republican, Eisenhower Republican. That doesn't even exist anymore. And it's hard to explain, like when the country was very hopeful in, coming off of the big 60s movements. It felt very hopeful in a way. I feel sorry for young people now because I don't think it feels hopeful. Like, I don't think there's things that they can plug into individual things that they find, but I don't think the mood. There was a nice mood for a while there.
Yeah, there was this mood of everybody's going to be okay. Well, remember, we were also coming off the 40s. We were coming off of the war. We were coming off, and the people
the GI Bill and the creation of a middle class, that's over.
The suburb over. Yeah, everything over.
Yeah.
It's
just over.
It's became, I don't know, this really different thing. And I think that the more that's written about that going forward, the more interesting it's going to be of a perspective of what it was. Of what it was. Like, this is what life was, everybody. My husband said the other night, very all family at dinner, he goes, I think John F. Kennedy today might have been a Republican. Like, he says, I'm really kidding.
He would have been like, a left of center Republican.
Yes. Yeah. And he says, it's hard to sit there and have, like, we're not talking about history. I mean, I like to know what students are learning about in history. I don't like getting up to World War II, or are we actually talking about like what's happened through the years and what happened in the 60s, what happened in the 70s. And I think it's really, really interesting. We didn't get here by last year or 10 years ago. We got here by 20 or 30 years ago.
Right, exactly.
Got us to here. And we're acting like it's who's ever in power now and who's ever here. But no, it was really this whole thing that came up just as the war in the 40s got us to the 60s.
Exactly.
Now
it's so true. It's so true. I'm very surprised all the time by my young women students and their impressions of what feminism was like in the 60s and 70s. Like, that's really not how I remember it. It really was, in my memory, it really was about liberation for men and women, liberation from certain kinds of gender roles, liberation from certain kinds of pressures, all kinds of things, and public policy, daycare, healthcare, all of these things. And that's not the way it's come down. It's come down that it was about bored suburban housewives who wanted to go into the workforce. And I'm like, well, that was sort of came later in the feminist movement, but it wasn't the whole idea of it at all. And I really think there's, what's that expression? To the victor goes the spoils. I sort of think what comes out of any history is those who kind of had the last word, not the first word. So I think it is really interesting to go back into those periods, especially for people who lived through them, and say how certain things started, not how they ended in the history books, but what was the inception of certain really powerful ideas before they got co-opted, before they got made into something into something that had like a certain kind of mass appeal, but like just really smart, sparkly ideas, and for people to understand that that's always possible. It's always possible to have that. I so agree with what you're saying, and it's an obsession of mine to think about everyone who died in World War II. What could they have done? Everyone who died during, I honestly, I think about this all the time.
Me too. Me too. It's like this obsession of who were these people along the way. And also I think of, and I'll just use Bobby Spezzacatina, who was this hairdresser that we worked with, but he had this fabulous personality. And when you got together with him, you were thinking like, oh, this is so much fun. And it wasn't just about hair, it was about lifestyle. But I also remember Bobby Spezzacatina being with me in the South, in Virginia, and saying, I said, let's go out to dinner. He goes, nope, I'm going to my hotel room and I'm locking the door. They'll string up people like me in this town. And my little suburban girl, New Jersey ideas were like, really? And I had no thought because I was just with him in a place. And I find that to be enormously interesting because my eyes were being opened just for traveling and being in other places with other people. You know?
It's so true. I was saying to someone recently, to a couple of my students, that like the late 70s were a really vibrant time to be a young gay man in New York. And then I caught myself and I said, well, in certain neighborhoods.
Right.
Not across the board. I mean, it was still illegal. It was, so I'm just like talking out of my individual experience and not remembering the whole thing. Like they wouldn't have thought that,
Well, even think about the gay men that were being preyed on in New York, and they were able to track down, who was doing this to them and killing them for money and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, this is still pervading. This is not something that went away. It's not something that disappeared. And I think that right now, if we want to take a look at where we are socially, and I'm not talking about politically, I'm talking about socially, where we are right now, we all need to do some pulling back and stop like just with the social media, but start pulling back and having some really big thoughts about how do we get here? How did kids get to where they're typing all day long and not looking up? And are these things all good? And look, I was part of it because I was one of these early sites online. I can take the rap, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, you didn't think it was going to lead to children having no social life and all the hatred that's on the internet and all of that.
Alice, here's a crazy thing. There's a law that came out, the COPA law, about kids online. And I had a site called Kids Reads and I had a site called Teen Reads. At the time, they were on AOL. We had to close down the chat rooms and the message boards that we had with those kids. And we had the kid that came home after school and wanted to hang out because they weren't in a club or something. They'd come and sit with us and talk to us, right? And they talk about books all afternoon. Well, we were considered marketing to children and we had to shut these things down. And I want to write a letter, like an editorial piece about shutting that down, talking about books to children. And now they're dancing on TikTok and they're doing all this and whatever. And there's no control. Where's the COPA law now? Where's COPA law version 2? Yeah. And I remember having to shut that down. And we had the kids that didn't have a lot of friends. Like they were coming home to type to us. But if they did things like they put their address on, we would lock them out, bring them in a private room and say, you can't do that. So you're out for the rest of the afternoon. You don't disclose personal things. And there would be like time out.
Can you imagine?
So just picture
that's that's such a great example of people just not understanding the big picture. No. Like you're doing something that's so valuable and that really is a place for children to go,
right,
and to have a social life. That's the thing. I think a lot of those early chat rooms were social. And now it's antisocial.
We had a whole chat room talking about this book, The Sparrow, that was 24/7. Everyone wanted to discuss the book, and you'd find what people's interests are. If people wanted to discuss this book all summer, we'd set up a chat room for them where they could go in and do that. And it was just they were crazy times. And then it was like, oh no, we have to be bigger and we have to be X, Y, and Z. And sometimes I want to go back to those early days. People say to me, like, why do you not have a page on Facebook? I said, because somebody would have to patrol it. Because somebody's going to make some political comment. The one thing I've never talked about politics, everybody knows it on our sites. They said, I have no idea what your political affiliation is. I said, it's got nothing to do with what I do all day long. It's never going to come up. Never going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
Switzerland. I'm Switzerland, everyone.
Look, it's great to be Switzerland.
Yeah, well, I want to continue. Well, I'm looking forward to the next book. I'm going to go back and read Into Gloaming because I'll be up on it for the next time. I hope to talk to you. Do you have a date for when that's supposed to come, or
supposed to come in 2025?
Okay,
like fall 2025, but we'll see because I am writing it. We'll see if I can keep the deadlines. I'm trying to.
Well, you have time to read this, everybody. Fabulous book. I think probably my favorite book of 2022. Honestly,
wow.
I sit back and look because there's so much that I brought out of it. There's just so much. And if it were like, a couple, it's like, fine, but this is really where I really, really absolutely loved. So I look forward to talking to you again. I hope we see each other in person somewhere along the way as well, which is such fun.
So wonderful.
We're so close by.
So many, I love an idea person like you. It's amazing to just hear you talk about the things you've done and the things you're thinking about. I mean, it's really great.
And we may think about this for a Bookachino live book group where I ask some questions and then we go live with audience. The audience comes on screen and then people just ask questions. And I'm going to reach out and say, think about reading this, and we'll do it in the fall. Because I think it'd be a fascinating book to be able to have you come on and talk to people as well.
That'd be really fun.
Which near and far.
So it'd be great if that worked out.
Thank you endlessly for joining me. I so appreciate we finally were able to make this happen.
Yeah, me too, Carol. This has been really fun.
Okay. You can go back to writing now. Okay. Thanks so much. You can go back to writing.
Bye-bye.
See you next time. Okay. Bye-bye now.